Hello, welcome back to another in our series of introductions to Homer and Literature Humanities at Columbia University. I'm Joseph Howley. I'm a professor in the Classics Department, and I'm the Paul Brook Program Chair of Literature Humanities. With me now is Kate Meng Brassel, who is an expert in Latin literature, on which she wrote a PhD here in our Classics Department, where she also taught Lit Hum for several years. And since she finished her PhD, she's been teaching in the University of Pennsylvania's Department of Classical Studies. Professor Brassel, thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm always excited to come back to Lit Hum.
We're always excited to have you join us. I wanted to talk to you today about one of these questions that we find ourselves starting the year with, whether we've taught the class 1,000 times or we're reading the Iliad for the first time. It's one of these questions that seems like it has a simple answer, and then it only gets more complicated when you look at it. The question is, what is the Iliad about? I think one thing we find when we start reading the first 6 books, which is what we've asked the students to read this summer, is that a lot of the action in the first 6 books is set in these military camps and battlefields. The characters are generals and soldiers. And it's easy to think, well, okay, this is a poem about the Trojan War, or this is a poem about war. How do you think about this question? What's the Iliad about?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's actually not a simple question. And I think the answer changes for everyone over time. So, for example, when I first read the Iliad, which was a million years ago, as a Lit Hum student, it seemed to me that the Iliad was really about the devastation of mass loss, of mass death. Oh. And this was all the more critical at the time because the year previously, the city had suffered the attacks of September 11th, and we had at the end of our childhoods really come close to the experience of mass death. For students today, this will have like a really different meaning. Of course, our Lit Hum students today will have experienced mass death in a different way because of the pandemic, which came and took so many lives from so many different communities. And yet again, even more recently, and looking towards the future, the deaths from climate catastrophes, which seem to form much of the landscape of the world that we live in. And so I think that's one of the reason why I sort of bring up death to begin with is because for me, this book is really about grief and how different types of people cope with grief over mass loss, and grief for themselves and grief for others, grief for their cultures, grief for their lovers. And what the poem for me is also about increasingly is how when you fail to grieve properly, when you fail to really process grief properly, that feeling of anger and vengeance can become extremely destructive. And so you'll see different characters, most notably Achilles, who in the first 6 books, a lot of you will just think that he's kind of a pain. He's not really playing the game that he's supposed to be playing, and he's kind of bitter, and that's true. But you know, the poet puts in the first line of the Iliad that this is a song about anger. And Achilles really substitutes anger in many ways for grief, and it has lasting consequences for everyone in this epic, in this very, very long poem. And it's not just human anger and grief, but also environmental anger and grief and despair. Later in the epic, this is sort of probably in your last set of readings, the environment will sort of be personified in a river who just is overwhelmed by the destruction that Achilles is wreaking on the landscape. And so one of the things that I've had the opportunity to think about, because you've asked me to reflect on what the Iliad is about this year, is really the grief and anger of the environment. and in response to human ambition and human failure to put ambition aside for community, for grief, and for loss. But it's not just about death and grief. The poem is also really about desire. So one of the students in Lit Hum who took the class, I think the same year that I took it, her name is Rachel Lesser. She's a professor of classics now at Gettysburg College. She recently published a whole book about the Iliad as a poem about desire. That desire is what moves both the epic and its audience, and in today's world, its readership. And I think this is also a really important thread to pull when you're reading the epic and thinking about the epic's characters. And those desires are sometimes desire for something and also sometimes desire for a person. And you'll see desire, especially sort of homosocial desire and homoerotic desire, coming up in these first 6 books and really maybe first 9 books in ways that I assure students it's not just you, that the interpretation of the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus as homoerotic has very, very long-standing ancient attestations. And also Helen has desire for Aphrodite, for a goddess, which is something that is important to sort of pick up through the Helen character. And so there are all sorts of ways that the epic is long. It's like a tapestry of many different human emotions, and you should pull on the emotion that most speaks to you and is most useful to your sort of personal trajectory at this time.
That's a really helpful answer. Thank you. I wonder if we could maybe look at a little bit of the text now and get a sense of what you're talking about and how it looks in the text itself. Is there a passage you'd like to look at?
Why don't we look at book 3, since I sort of started turning us towards Helen. She's a character that many students and professors have strong feelings about. And a lot of what seems to happen to Helen in a sort of overt sense, is upsetting. And another way that I could have answered the earlier question is that, this is an epic about the traffic in women. And for a lot of people, and at different times in my own readings of the poem, that's what it's been centrally about.
Can I just pause to sort of clarify what you're talking about? I think I understand you to be saying, I think I understand you to mean this is a poem about the traffic in women that not only is set during the Trojan War, which is this 10-year conflict that is precipitated by the trafficking of one woman, it also begins with a conflict about an enslaved woman who was made property and is the subject of an argument. That sort of macro and micro, this text revolves around the treatment of women as property, as cargo, as things to be moved and taken.
Right. And so Helen is probably the most conspicuous figure for this, but Chryseis and Briseis, who are the 2 enslaved women in the camp of the Danaans, also stand in for the larger consequences of war upon women. Mm-hmm. As a side note, what I'll say is it's also there is also sort of gradient of consequences. Obviously, the women who are sort of overtly sex trafficked in this text suffer sort of deracination, being uprooted from their families, and they express this, and the problem of having to reassert themselves and the problem of finding sympathy elsewhere, which will come out later as the epic unfolds. But also among the women in the city under siege, so Andromache and Hecuba, in particular, their lives are also shattered. There is sort of no, and they are as high up in society as you can get. Hecuba is a queen, and Andromache is married to the prince Hector, and their lives are equally shattered. But with Helen, we get to have a moment with her in book 3, a sort of extended moment with her in book 3, where we really come to see Helen as having a privileged relationship to knowledge. She is the only character, human character, I should say, in the text, other than the poet, who seems to have this sort of bird's eye view of what's going on. She's the only human character who has sort of privileged, intimate knowledge about both sides. And she's the only human character who engages in an active representation at the same level of the poet, where she's depicting a whole scene. And that active representation, her artwork, is represented in importantly gendered ways that really give significance to this kind of work. So if we turn to a little bit earlier in book 3, to the first moment we come upon Helen in the city of Troy, we see her weaving this giant web, this red folding robe. And those are both, that is a physical object, and also weaving a web and a red robe will become sort of importantly symbolic, like as the Lit Hum semester unfolds. So it is both a robe and also something else. So just keep it in the back of your head and maybe dog ear the page. But you'll see here that Helen is working into this robe that she is weaving, the actual story that she is living in right now, the struggles of the Trojans and the bronze armored Achaeans. Another thing that we might want to notice about this passage, which is jumping out to me now, is just how Helen is described. So your teachers might discuss with you something called an epithet. You don't have to know that word. It is sometimes useful to see, Helen of the white arms, or Hector of the great helm, or Menelaus of the nice thighs, or something you might see. But here, Helen of the white arms it's sort of important to think about what this epithet means here, and also to just register the difference between contemporary culture and ancient cultures. This is a moment where we can sort of actually see how different our cultures are. Whiteness in this period of antiquity is really associated with femininity. So if you ever see a male figure described as white in this character, he's being feminized actually a bit. And so you'll see at a certain point, Menelaus's thigh compared to a piece of ivory. And there's something a little bit of erotic going on there. And it's not necessarily the type of the way that Menelaus would have wanted to think of his own legs. So in this period, sort of darkness is associated with the masculine body and the warrior body, and whiteness or paleness is associated with the indoor female body. That's just sort of a side note, but I think an important side note. So if we start again with this passage, if you don't mind turning the page, Joe.
Yeah.
So this passage morphs into a scene that is often referred to as the scene from the wall, or the view from the wall, really, where Helen is joined by the Trojan elder men, who are really pretty high status, though they're removed from the fighting due to their elderliness. And they really rely upon Helen's knowledge to interpret the scene. And so Helen becomes like a poet here. And she also is the character who is sort of, other than, I would say, Achilles and Hector, is the most aware of her own sort of epic status. She's very self-conscious in this way. She tells Hector that what they have in common is that they will be the subject of song in the future. So this is an important scene to dig into. If we then flip forward a few pages, where we're still really staying with Helen, but this time instead of Iris coming to see her, it's Aphrodite. This is the scene where Helen is again back at her weaving, working with the Trojan women. And you'll see at the bottom of this page, on the right-hand page, around 395
here.
Yeah, this is where Helen's encounter with Aphrodite really arouses desire in Helen, and we see through Helen's eyes, we're looking with Helen here at the round sweet throat of the goddess, her desirable breasts, and her eyes full of shining. And so there's something going on here, and I would really hesitate and discourage people from immediately sort of turning Aphrodite into a sort of symbol of desire, because I think that really flattens the interaction here. Helen is roused to desire by Aphrodite herself and by her sort of very physicality and her embodiment. I think it's important not to flatten that out into some sort of allegory for desire. If we then turn the page, we see that this erotic confrontation becomes really angsty. Helen is actually really angry about the feelings that Aphrodite arouses in her for Paris. And this confrontation is really, really important. You really rarely see humans anywhere speaking to gods like this. But Helen has had enough with Aphrodite at this moment. And Aphrodite has appeared to Helen to tell Helen to go to Paris. And you would think that a goddess's command would sort of, be sort of immediate marching orders for Helen. But she says, she really basically in this passage says to Aphrodite, why do you have such affection for this guy Paris? And, if you think that he needs a beautiful woman so badly, go yourself and sit beside him, she says. That's in 406. And then a little further on, this is quite biting, right, and reflects the circumstances she is, until he makes you his wedded wife or makes you his slave girl. And then 410, I think, is really important. Not I am not going with him. It would be too shameful. And the reason I think it's important to just spend a moment with this line is because often it can feel like in this epic that women have no agency, but they do have moral agency. They do make decisions. It does not mean that they live in a world where their decisions are at all respected. But the poem is representing Helen as having very clearly articulating what she wants to the goddess. And that's sort of important and uncomfortable to sit with, but important to notice here, I think.
Can I jump in here? Because I think that's a really important point you've made. And I want to say something just briefly about how it is that we come to register this idea that's so important, that, as you say, cuts against the assumption we might have, well, here's like a Bronze Age society, women have no agency, women have no power, and that actually the text is not showing us that. It's showing us something quite different. In one of these other conversations, I spoke to Professor Jagannathan in the philosophy department about our sort of reading strategies. How do we know what's important? What are the things on the page that arrest us or grab our attention? And the line you just drew our attention to here, 410, something we might notice just in terms of how language is structured, is that this is a poem with lots of speeches, and when people talk, they often speak for many lines. And then here, this line 410, we have three very short sentences in the space of one line. So here the kind of the pace of the speech and the language changes in a way that I think is meant to catch the ear or catch the eye. And if we let that change in the flow of the text grab our attention and we sit with it and think about what's really being said, I think that's a way into the kind of insight you've just articulated. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's true. It can be really overwhelming to read all these speeches and to ask yourself what's important. I'm fairly agnostic about the question what's important. I think really what's important is whatever a reader feels is important and is motivated to meditate upon and to track down and to see what happens to that elsewhere in the epic. I think not I is really powerful. It's just not something that's really said in this poem. And so it is arresting. And I take your point that it does come in this sort of set of short, jagged statements. It's as little flowery and ornate as you could possibly get for this poem. I think too, and So, I'm not a humorist. I don't read this for work. I now just sort of read this for pleasure. For me, going back to your point about how do you know what's important? So I work on satire. I find laughter really fascinating. I find why we laugh to be kind of insane. And even after many years, I don't really know why we do it. But what's curious for me is why people laugh in the Iliad. And I've learned a lot from tracking how people laugh in the Iliad. So for example, Helen marks the shame of potentially going to bed with Paris as an object of laughter, which to me means here that one of the reasons why people laugh in the Iliad is derision, right? And it is somehow a mechanism of excluding somebody or of shaming. Laughter here is really, there are many theories of laughter, but laughter in the Iliad has this, seems at least to have this really policing effect.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important point about laughter. And I think this might be a good moment to turn back to book 2 and look at what I think of as maybe the first big instance of someone who gets laughed at in the poem that I think really illustrates some of what you're talking about. And this is Thersites, right?
Yeah. So I find this to be a really fascinating scene. And Thersites as a figure is someone I'm actually now thinking about returning to in my late age. Basically, so this is in book 2, and you all remember that there is just an argument at council. I actually don't even remember what the particular argument is, but it doesn't even matter. There is an argument at council. Agamemnon and Achilles are not on the same page, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. And there's some dissension among the ranks. And the dissension among the ranks is sort of an important thing to just sort of register when you're understanding this scene, and this book in general. So if we're looking at the right-hand page here, so now the rest had sat down and were orderly in their place, but one man, Thersites of the endless speech, still scolded, who knew within his head many words, but disorderly words, that is, vain and without decency, to quarrel with the princes, with any word he thought might be amusing to the Argives. And so we've learned that Thersites, the first thing we notice about him is that he is a talker, and he's like a brash talker. He likes to stir up trouble, to be quarrelsome. Okay, so maybe we're not meant to like Thersites in this way, but this is the part that I find really, really interesting. So not only is he of endless speech, which in a book of pretty long speeches is some kind of an insult, but fine, he's of endless speech. But at line 216, we learned this was the ugliest man who came beneath Ilion. Ilion is Troy, right? This was the ugliest man who'd come with them, basically, who'd come with the Greeks. He was bandy-legged and went lame of one foot, with shoulders stooped and drawn together over his chest. And above this, his skull went up to a point with the wool grown sparsely upon it. This is a pretty complete picture. We don't usually actually get full body portraits of characters in this way. So it is really important to the poet, apparently, to really give you a bottom to top description of Thersites. There's some things that interest me that won't really be appropriate here, but it is noticeable that the character who is quarrelsome is also significantly the character who is disabled. And we should just keep that in mind as we now look at his speech. So Thersites then basically throws at Agamemnon, who, as you know by now, is like the leader, the head guy, the same complaint that Achilles does. Right. He has the same sorts of accusations for Agamemnon about bad leadership. And, if we turn the page, really no one is having it, which is kind of crazy. Odysseus comes and puts him down in that way that Odysseus does in this book, because he is just sort of Agamemnon's hype man and enforcer. But then on the bottom of the next page, around 265, so Odysseus strikes Thersites. So this guy is already in some kind of physical condition, and he Odysseus strikes him with his scepter, which is that like big, heavy metal staff, forces him to double over, and he starts to cry. He starts to weep. Thersites does, right? And acquires a new wound, a bloody welt. He's frightened, he's in pain, and he's helpless. If we turn the page yet again, this to me is like the most interesting line in the book. Sorry though the men were. So the men feel sorry because Thersites has been beaten. He's already down. He's been beaten even more. He's crying and he's helpless. Sorry that the men were, they laughed over him happily, and thus they would speak to each other. You see here, really this laughter as a tool of social enforcement. And it's worth thinking, although, you know, today for very good reasons, we discourage people from laughing at people. You know, there's the distinction you learn in school, like laugh with, not at. We could still, I think, worth thinking about the ways in which we actually do use laughter to reinforce social norms, even laughter that we might think of as subversive in some way. But anyway, that's my own little hobby horse with Thersites. But Thersites is a good character to think about also if you're thinking about whose opinions count in a supposedly deliberative body, who has the privilege to state an unpopular opinion and actually be honored for it, and who is beaten down for it, and who gets to sort of speak truth to power.
It's a tricky character, Thersites, because if I go back to look at the speech, every time I read this, I think he's making a great point. He's like a highly sympathetic argument, right? And the text both like brings in this critique of Agamemnon that seems so sympathetic and reasonable. You think, yeah, Thersites is kind of speaking for the common man here. And then but when we met Thersites, we've been told there's something, he's wrong in the head. His body is like not normative, and therefore he's not to be trusted. And then as soon as he's done speaking, the narrator sort of blames him for abusing Agamemnon, the shepherd of the people. You know, how dare you talk to a leader this way? And as you say, he's immediately punished. He's the object of derision. This to me is every year, this is a puzzle. Like, why is the critique here? Why is it encased in this way that sort of tells you, well, don't take this seriously, this guy is bad, and yet like it sounds so good.
Yeah, and I think one of the maybe interesting things, I don't think that that's a question that can be sort of resolved within inside the epic itself. However, it might interest people to know that like that detail of the harsh truth teller who's kind of not that great looking and has a bad foot, that actually becomes a separate tradition of poetry in the ancient period, where the idea that you are like unattractive to look at, and you say the truth, but it's really unpopular, and you have a physical disability, that becomes a type of poet in their own right. It's called iambic poetry, and it's kind of like the counterweight to epic. And that character is invested, that figure, that type of storyteller or poetry becomes his own sort of powerful persona in the ancient world. So I think also, here we actually have that kind of figure just kind of like dropped in here, but the afterlife of Thersites will be elsewhere.
It's not quite what you're talking about, but later in the semesters, you know, we'll read Plato's Symposium, in which one of the main characters is Socrates. And there's a really important moment at the end of the text where someone is asked, well, why do you love Socrates so much? And the answer is, well, he's like one of these statues of the ugly god Silenus, that's like ugly and has an unattractive body on the outside, but inside there's like the pure light of truth. Yeah,
and Socrates also, he's not lame of foot, but he is barefoot. He goes without shoes, and he's a truth teller, and he's not conventionally attractive. So there's a lot to do there with such characters.
This has been such a really rich and helpful conversation, and I'm really grateful for the way you've shared not just your view on kind of the big pictures of some of the things the poem is about, but also how you kind of come to these insights through your reading of the text, and how we make our way through these passages and find these things that are interesting to us and give us a thread to follow. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Take care.